For most of Joan Jett's life, stopping has never looked natural on her. That is probably the first thing worth understanding. The leather jacket, the black hair, the guitar held low, that stare that seems to challenge anyone watching her, all of it created an image that felt almost immune to time. Joan Jett did not simply perform rock and roll. She came to represent a certain refusal. Refusal to soften. Refusal to disappear. Refusal to become what other people expected her to become. And then at 67, her own body forced a different conversation. In August 2026, Joan revealed that she had undergone orthopedic surgery after suffering a fractured vertebra. The injury meant cancelled appearances, physical therapy, and something that perhaps sounds simple until you consider who we are talking about. Rest. Doctors wanted Joan Jett to stop performing while she recovered. That detail matters. Not because recovery itself is unusual. Musicians cancel shows, bodies break down, tours get interrupted. But with Joan, the interruption carries another meaning. She had spent decades convincing people that she could keep going. Only weeks earlier she had been performing again in Britain, returning for headline shows after a long absence. Audiences were still hearing the songs that made her famous decades ago. Bad Reputation. Cherry Bomb. I Hate Myself for Loving You. The years were visible. Of course they were. But they had not defeated the performance. That distinction is important. There is often something uncomfortable about watching musicians grow older, because audiences quietly expect two impossible things at once. We want them to remain exactly as we remember them, but we also want proof that they have survived. You cannot have both. The person on stage at 67 is not the woman who first walked into a rehearsal room as a teenager. And yet the moment the guitar begins, memory does something strange. For a few minutes, the distance collapses. You hear the same chords. You remember where you were. Maybe you remember somebody who is no longer sitting beside you. That is one reason news of Joan's injury landed differently for longtime fans. It was not simply a medical update. It was a reminder. These people we grew up watching are not frozen inside the records. They have bodies. Bodies that eventually keep score. And Joan's body has absorbed more than most people probably think about when they see her walk onto a stage. Decades of touring, late nights, airports, buses, repeated performances, the physical repetition of carrying a guitar and delivering the same energy, night after night, long after younger artists would have disappeared backstage exhausted. Rock music likes to pretend that none of that matters. It celebrates endurance but rarely talks about the cost. That may be the part of Joan's recent surgery that deserves more attention. The announcement said she hated disappointing fans. It sounds like an ordinary sentence. Almost every performer says something similar after cancelling a show. But listen to it again in the context of Joan Jett. She did not say she was relieved to stop. She did not frame the break as welcome. The concern was disappointing people. There is a personality inside that reaction, a person accustomed to pushing through. And I think that is where this story becomes more revealing than a simple injury report, because there are moments when determination stops being enough. You can work through rejection. You can outlast critics. You can start your own record company when nobody wants to sign you. You can walk into spaces where people clearly do not believe you belong, but you cannot negotiate with a fractured vertebra. That is different. Your body does not care about reputation. It does not care how many people are waiting outside a venue. It does not care that you once turned rejection into one of the most recognizable careers in rock music. Eventually, it asks something from you, sometimes gently, sometimes not. And Joan now has to listen. There was another detail that made the timing feel almost cruel. Around the end of her European performances, Joan had been thanking audiences and looking forward to what came next. Then came surgery, recovery, cancelled dates, physical therapy. That quick shift tells us something that gets lost in celebrity stories. Life usually changes before people are prepared to change with it. One day there is another show, another trip, another plan. Then suddenly, the calendar becomes irrelevant. Anyone who has reached a certain age understands that feeling. A pain you thought would pass, an appointment you expected to be routine, a doctor saying something that makes the next few months look different. There is no spotlight in those moments, no anthem playing underneath them, just a person hearing that things cannot continue exactly as before. And perhaps that is the most human Joan Jett has looked in years. Not weaker, human. There is a difference, because the Joan Jett story has often been reduced to toughness. The woman who wouldn't quit, the woman who proved everyone wrong, the woman who made it in a world that did not make much room for women like her. All of that is true, but it is incomplete. Toughness can hide a great deal. Rejection, loneliness, broken friendships, people lost along the way, and the strange pressure of spending your entire adult life associated with an image that rarely permits vulnerability. The fractured vertebra did not create that story. It merely exposed the doorway into it. Because once you stop looking only at the leather jacket and the defiance, Joan Jett's life begins to look very different, and some of the hardest moments came long before her body finally told her to stop. Before Joan Jett became a symbol of defiance, she spent years being told, in one way or another, that there was no place for her. That part is easy to romanticize now. People look back and say she was ahead of her time. Maybe she was. But being ahead of your time is not very comforting when nobody wants to sign you. After the Runaways fell apart, Joan was left in a strange position. She had already tasted fame, already been on stage, already learned what it felt like to have people watching her. Then suddenly, the momentum disappeared, and the record industry was not waiting for her with open arms. Joan and producer Kenny Laguna began shopping her music around. The answer kept coming back the same. No. Again. And again. 23 record labels rejected her. That number matters because it changes the way we understand what happened next. Today, I Love Rock and Roll feels inevitable. It feels like one of those songs that was always going to become enormous. But nothing was inevitable. There was a period when the people whose job was supposedly to recognize commercial music listened to Joan Jett and decided she was not worth the risk. That is the part I find revealing. The industry did not misunderstand one song, it misunderstood her. Joan was too rough for some people, too direct, too difficult to package. She did not fit comfortably into the polished idea of what a female rock star was supposed to look or sound like, and instead of changing herself, she helped build another route. Blackheart Records was born out of necessity, not vanity. Necessity. That difference often gets lost. Starting your own label sounds bold once you know the ending. At the time, it was closer to being told nobody wanted what you were selling and deciding to sell it yourself anyway. You can imagine what that must do to someone. Confidence on the outside, questions underneath. Because no matter how rebellious you are, 23 rejections still mean 23 moments when someone looked at your work and said, effectively, we don't see it. Joan kept moving, and that decision changed everything. But there is another side to survival people rarely talk about. When you spend years proving that you do not need anyone's approval, you can become very good at hiding how much rejection once hurt. The leather gets thicker, the answers get shorter. You learn not to show hesitation. Perhaps that is why Joan's toughness became such a powerful part of her identity. It was not only style, it may also have been armor, and armor is useful. Until people forget, there is still a person underneath it. People often talk about the Runaways as if they were simply the beginning of Joan Jett's story. A teenage band, a rebellious chapter, a stepping stone towards something bigger. But that version is too neat. The Runaways gave Joan visibility, yes. They also gave her scars she carried long after the band was gone. She was still a teenager when the group began attracting attention. The image was provocative, the music was loud, and the press often seemed more interested in the fact that they were young women than in what they were actually trying to play. That imbalance mattered. The band was marketed as something dangerous and exotic, but the girls inside it were also trying to become musicians in an industry that rarely treated them with the same seriousness as male bands. That tension never really disappeared. Joan learned early that being watched was not the same as being respected. And perhaps that explains why she became so protective of her identity later. The Runaways toured relentlessly. They built a passionate audience overseas, especially in Japan. But behind the photographs and stage lights, The relationships inside the band became increasingly strained. Different ambitions, different personalities, different ideas about what the group should become. It is easy, decades later, to reduce that collapse to creative differences. But when you are young, a band can feel less like a job and more like a family you chose for yourself. When it breaks, the loss is personal. Joan stayed attached to the idea of hard rock. Others wanted different directions. Eventually the group fractured, and that was not the end of the emotional complexity. Years later, the women would speak differently about those days. Some remembered the excitement. Others remembered exploitation, pressure, and situations they were too young to fully understand at the time. That part is uncomfortable. It should be. Nostalgia has a habit of polishing the past until the difficult details disappear. But Joan's early career does not make sense unless you allow both things to exist at once. The Runaways were groundbreaking, and they were vulnerable, they were celebrated, and they were dismissed. They were young women being told they were powerful while often having very little control over the machinery around them. There is another detail people sometimes overlook. Joan never seemed interested in publicly turning those years into a long list of grievances. She kept moving. That does not mean nothing hurt. Silence and indifference are not the same thing. Sometimes people survive a difficult period by refusing to let it become the only story anyone tells about them. Joan did exactly that. But the past kept returning. Through documentaries, through reunions that never fully happened, through old photographs, through the deaths and struggles of people connected to that era, and through the strange experience of watching younger generations celebrate a band that in its own time was often treated as disposable. If you grew up with Joan Jett, you may remember the confidence first, the sneer, the attitude, the sense that nobody could tell her what to do. But confidence can be built from bruises. Sometimes the strongest public image comes from someone who learned very young what it felt like to be underestimated, objectified, and left to figure out the aftermath alone. The Runaways did not simply launch Joan Jett. They taught her what the industry could take from you, and once she learned that lesson, she spent the rest of her career trying to make sure nobody could take that much control again. There is a version of Joan Jett that people know instantly. Black hair, black leather, a guitar. A face that rarely seemed interested in asking permission. But the longer you look at her life, the more that image starts to feel incomplete. Because Joan did not simply survive rejection. She survived people disappearing. Some through distance, some through fractured relationships, and some through death. One of the hardest examples came from the world that had shaped her as a teenager. Sandy West, the drummer of the Runaways, died in 2006 after battling lung cancer. She was only 47. That detail changes the way old footage feels. Watch the Runaways now and you see young women moving with the confidence of people who have no idea how short some lives will be. Sandy behind the drums, Joan at the guitar, everything still ahead of them. Decades later, Joan would speak about Sandy with obvious affection and respect, and I think there is something important in that. The Runaways did not end cleanly. There were disagreements, resentment, different memories of what had happened. But death has a strange way of stripping away the argument and leaving only the person. You stop remembering who wanted which musical direction. You remember the laugh, the rehearsals, the van rides. The person who once stood beside you when both of you were too young to understand where any of this was going. That kind of loss does not fit comfortably inside Joan Jett's public image. There is no rebellious pose for grief, no perfect guitar riff that makes it disappear. And Sandy was not the only reminder that Joan's generation was beginning to thin out. Over the decades, musicians she had known, admired, worked around, or shared stages with began to vanish. That happened slowly at first. Then, at a certain age, it seems to accelerate. Anyone in their 60s or 70s knows this feeling. You open the newspaper, you see a familiar face. Another person from your youth is gone. And somehow their death touches your own timeline. Not because you were close to them, because they were there when you were younger. Joan has rarely turned that reality into spectacle. That restraint is worth noticing. Modern celebrity culture encourages confession. Every wound is expected to become an interview. Every private sadness becomes content. Joan has often done the opposite. She gives enough. Then she closes the door. Some people interpret that as coldness. I'm not convinced. There is another possibility. Maybe privacy became one of the few things she could still control. After a teenage career in which strangers constantly commented on her body, her sexuality, her appearance and her relationships, keeping certain things private may not have been avoidance. It may have been survival. And that makes the image of Joan at 67 more complicated. The woman fans see today is not simply the teenager who refused to quit. She is someone who has watched pieces of her past disappear, people, places, versions of herself, and yet she still walks toward the stage. That is what makes the recent injury feel heavier than it first appears. A fractured vertebra is physical, but recovery also creates silence. No crowd, no guitar drowning out the room, more time alone with memory. And sometimes, when life finally forces a person to slow down, the things they have spent decades outrunning have a way of becoming louder. There is something almost deceptive about Joan Jett's success. From a distance, it looks like victory solved everything. The rejected musician became a star. The woman record labels did not understand sold millions of records. The teenager, once treated like a curiosity, eventually entered the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That is the version history prefers, but recognition does not go backward and repair what happened before it arrived. Joan learned that in ways that were not always visible. By the time I Love Rock and Roll exploded in 1982, she had finally achieved the kind of success that executives once insisted she could not have. The song reached #1 in America and stayed there for weeks. Suddenly everybody understood Joan Jett, or at least they thought they did, and perhaps that was another strange burden. The world had spent years telling her she did not fit. Then, almost overnight, it reduced her to another image, the invincible woman in black who didn't care what anybody thought. But people are rarely that simple. Joan has always guarded her private life carefully. Questions about relationships, sexuality, and personal choices have followed her for decades, often more aggressively than similar questions followed male rock stars. She frequently refused to provide the answers people wanted. Some saw that as mysterious. Others called it evasive. I think there is a more interesting interpretation. Maybe Joan understood very early that once you give the public something personal, you do not necessarily get it back. She had already experienced what it meant to be young and watched, photographed, judged, discussed by strangers. Why would adulthood suddenly make her eager to surrender more? That distance became part of her survival, but there was a cost to it. When someone builds such a strong boundary around vulnerability, audiences can begin to believe vulnerability does not exist. Joan became the tough one, the survivor, the woman who could take rejection and turn it into fuel. And that image followed her even into later life. Yet fame could not protect her from losing Sandy West. It could not prevent the deaths of people she loved. It could not stop aging. And now it cannot heal a fractured vertebra simply because there are fans waiting for another show. That contradiction becomes harder to ignore at 67. Joan spent much of her life proving that other people could not decide when she was finished. Record executives couldn't. Critics couldn't. Changing musical fashions couldn't. Even the passage from rebellious teenage rocker to older woman in an industry obsessed with youth did not remove her. But the body is not a critic. You cannot prove it wrong by selling another record. Perhaps that is why this moment carries more emotional weight than a cancelled concert normally would. For once, Joan is dealing with something determination cannot immediately fix. Healing has its own schedule. And if you have ever been forced to slow down after decades of independence, you know how unsettling that can feel. It is not always the pain that frightens you. Sometimes it is the interruption, the sudden empty space where routine used to be. Joan has spent more than half a century moving toward the next rehearsal, the next recording, the next audience. Now there is physical therapy, recovery, waiting, and waiting does not fit the Joan Jett mythology very well. Maybe that is precisely why it belongs in the story. Because the most revealing moment in a strong person's life is not always when they fight. Sometimes it is when fighting is no longer the answer. And for Joan, accepting that distinction may be one of the hardest adjustments of all. The world learned decades ago that Joan Jett was difficult to stop. What nobody really knows yet is how she handles being told that, for now, she has to. At 67, Joan Jett is living with a contradiction she has spent most of her life avoiding. She is still Joan Jett, and she is no longer the Joan Jett people first remember. Both things are true. That may sound obvious, but celebrity culture rarely allows aging to be that simple. We either expect people to remain untouched by time, or we treat every sign of age as evidence that something has been lost. Joan's story resists both ideas. She is recovering from surgery. She has had to cancel performances. Her body has forced her to slow down. But none of that erases what came before. If anything, it makes the earlier years easier to understand. The rejection, the runaways, the years of being underestimated, the losses, the privacy, the refusal to let other people tell her what she was allowed to become. All of those moments point toward the same thing. Control mattered to Joan, maybe more than people realized. When record companies rejected her, she found another way. When critics tried to define her, she kept playing. When the industry wanted women in rock to fit a particular shape, she refused to cooperate. But recovery asks for a different kind of strength. It asks for patience. That is not the same skill. There is no applause for waiting. No crowd sees the exercises in physical therapy. No one cheers when you manage a little more movement than the week before. Recovery is repetitive and private. In some ways, it is the opposite of rock and roll, and yet maybe this is where Joan's character is being tested most honestly. Not in front of thousands of people. In the quiet, we tend to talk about older performers as though continuing to work is automatically proof that they are winning against age. I am not sure that is always fair. Sometimes continuing is courageous. Sometimes stopping is. The difficult part is knowing which moment you are in. Joan appears to understand that, even if she does not seem particularly happy about it. Her public message after the injury focused on getting better and returning when she could. There was no grand farewell, no dramatic announcement that an era had ended, and that feels appropriate. Because Joan Jett has never seemed interested in writing the ending before she reaches it. Still, something has changed. You cannot hear about a fractured vertebra at 67 and pretend time is not part of the conversation anymore. That does not make the story tragic simply because she is older. The tragedy is subtler. It is the recognition that even the people who once seemed permanent are moving through the same fragile years as everyone else. Maybe that is why stories like this affect longtime fans so deeply. You remember the first time you heard the voice, the first video, the first record. Perhaps you were young enough then to believe certain people would always be exactly where you left them. And then decades pass. Suddenly you are watching them recover from surgery. And without meaning to, you start thinking about your own life. That is what nostalgia really does. It does not only bring the past back, it measures the distance between then and now. Joan Jett has become one of those measurements. She was young when many of her listeners were young. She fought through middle age while they did the same. Now she is entering another phase, and the audience that grew up beside her understands the language of that phase immediately. Doctors, recovery, slowing down, people missing, plans changing. But there is another way to see Joan at 67. Perhaps the most interesting part of her story is no longer that she refused to be broken. Maybe it is that she has been forced to accept that being hurt and being defeated are not the same thing. That distinction matters. A body can need repair, a career can pause, a person can carry grief, disappointment, and limitations without becoming smaller than the life they built. Joan Jett never needed to be invincible to matter. People only mistook her for invincible because she became so good at moving forward. Now, for a while, forward may look slower. Maybe that is enough. The guitar is still there. The songs are still there. And somewhere between the woman who was rejected 23 times and the woman now learning how to let her body heal, there is a life that looks far more complicated than the black leather ever suggested. Not finished, not untouched, just still moving, only differently now.